So, the feeling.
That's me.
So, the feeling.
That's me.
So, the feeling.
I'm off.
So,
Oh.
the feeling.
Yeah, that should be on.
I'm off. Your microphone.
So, the feeling.
Yeah, that should be on.
I'm off. Your microphone.
So, the feeling.
Oh, yeah. Up here. Oh, we can close. Yeah.
We get started. Seems everything's ready. My attendees was on. Oh, there's Jess.
There it is.
No, he's, no, you are.
Oh, no, that's Brett.
And Jeff is coming on. Okay.
I'm here.
All right, welcome.
Thank you.
I call the June 3rd, 2024 Bend Planning Commission meeting to order. Commissioners, please state your name. Let's start with you, Jeff.
Jeff Payne.
Bob.
Bob Gressens.
Hammer.
Suzanne Johansson.
Nathan Nelson.
Okay, thank you. Welcome to the meeting. If there's anyone here who would like to speak to the address the Plan Commission on items within the general purview of the commission and not on tonight's agenda, please raise your hand. And that includes online or in the room. Anyone online? Okay. Okay, thank you. For the work session, we are here to address PLTEXT 2023-0178, legislative text amendments to the Bend Development Code relating to tree preservation and street tree and planter strip landscaping requirements. This is a work session for the commission tonight, and we're here to learn more about the material. This is not a public hearing. The public hearing will occur next Monday night at the same time in the same location. Therefore, there won't be any public testimony tonight. So Pauline, do you want to make your presentation?
Sure, thank you. Good evening, commissioners. My name is Pauline Hardy. I'm at the City Planning Department. Echoing. With me tonight, I have Jeff Harris. He was the Chair of the Tree Regulation Update Advisory Committee. So he's here to help answer any questions that the commission may have regarding the committee's process and recommendation. And then I can help answer any questions that is in the overall package of code amendments. And it is nice to meet two of the new commissioners, Nathan and Bob. I've had the pleasure of working with throughout the Tree Act committee. So the agenda tonight, since it is such a big package, I thought I'd just put together what we're going to go through. One is the City Council Environmental and Climate Goal, which is what we are working off of throughout this whole process. I want to go through the summary of the Tree Regulation Update Advisory Committee process that we went through. At the highlight of the proposed code amendments, so not just the TRUAC recommendations, but the entire package of amendments. Talk about what is currently required in the Bend Development Code when it comes to tree regulation versus what's being proposed. Talk about the recommendations, not only what TRUAC's recommending, but what's in the package. In addition to just tree preservation, I want to highlight additional recommendations for street trees, as well as a new planter strip landscaping requirements in what we call planter strip. And I'll go into more detail about that. Talk about the public outreach that has taken place, and then next steps, which includes where public comments can be addressed before the Planning Commission and City Council. So the goal that we've been working off of, and this started back in 2023, and it's carried over in the council's new goals for 23 through 25, is their environmental and climate goal. And it's to improve the quality of life for more people that reside in Bend by increasing access to clean air, water, and healthy environment. It is followed by an action item to revise the Bend Development Code and other relevant standards to protect trees while balancing housing affordability and natural resource preservation. And council's been very clear about when we are looking at amending the Bend Development Code to look at balancing trees while at the same time balancing the development of housing and affordable housing. And council has heard from the community concerns about the loss of trees, but also is very adamant that we are balancing the development of housing while preserving trees. So the council created a tree regulation update advisory committee. This started back in May of 2023. They created a committee and a scope of work for the Tree Regulation Update Advisory Committee. And part of that scope was to make sure that all the codes that the city works with are consistent. And those three codes that we work with right now are the Bend Municipal Code, particularly Title 16, which talks about clearing and grading, and it addresses trees. Another code that most people are familiar with when they see trees being removed is the Bend Development Code, and that is chapter 3.2 for landscaping, street trees, fences and walls, and that addresses tree preservation when development occurs. And then there's another standards and specifications, chapter 12, which talks about some tree preservation and also street trees and irrigation in the public right-of-way. And each of those standards or codes all talk about in some way or another tree preservation, and today they're not very consistent with each other. So one of the objectives of this whole process and direction from council is to make sure that we provide consistency no matter what gets approved between the three codes. The Planning Commission's purview for this process is to review amendments to the Bend Development Code Chapter 3.2, the landscaping chapter. The City Council will be reviewing on June 20th amendments to the Bend Municipal Code Chapter 16.10 and also to the standards and specifications. So the scope is to make sure they're all consistent, but the Planning Commission will only be looking at the amendments to the Bend Development Code 3.2. Number two is pretty much what we just talked about, making sure that all three of them are consistent with each other and also that they are clear and objective. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about what that means for our task with the Bend Development Code, making sure that they're clear and objective. And that we also include a discretionary process, which TRUAC pretty much dove into, providing some optional discretionary processes for preserving trees. The third task that council is interested in is looking at preserving larger trees similar to the Southeast Area Plan. Didn't necessarily mean that they only had to preserve large trees, and the TRUAC even requested that we went back to council for clear direction on this particular scope of the project, and council did say that they were interested in preserving trees, all sizes. This was an example of the type of trees that we could look at, which was the Southeast Area Plan. And then the fourth one was, not in all cases are we able to preserve trees on site, and for TRUAC to look at other options to preserving trees, and that would be mitigation options, which will present some mitigation, which is preservation on site or replacement on site, as well as payment in lieu and replacement of preservation. And then lastly is to identify tree inventory programs to support preservation and expanding Bend's urban tree canopy. And that is outside the scope of actually amending the Bend Development Code, but we have been keeping an eye on the Oregon Department of Forestry. They are coming up with a program that will allow cities to map the canopies within the city limits, and it's not available yet. And so we're still working with them. And once it does become available, we're going to see if it, and I probably won't say this right, interacts appropriately with our GIS software. And if it does, we'll be able to use that system and map our canopy. And if it doesn't, then we'll start looking at other programs and grants available to help us be able to map our tree canopy. So we are continually working on number 5. Items 1, 2, 3, and 4 are really part of the scope for amendments to the codes that I talked about. So the Tree Regulation Update Advisory Committee, or TRUAC, included 15 community members. The mayor appointed them through a process where people got to apply. The 15 community members included members from our Human Rights and Equity Commission, our Environmental and Climate Committee, and our Affordable Housing Advisory Committee. It also included representation from our neighborhood associations. We had 2 remarkable arborists on the committee who were very helpful. We had a number of developers, architects, and engineers of affordable as well as production housing. We had a landscape architect, a couple of community members, and then representation from the Central Oregon Builders Association, or COBA, as well as Central Oregon Land Watch on the committee. TRUAC held 9 meetings. I believe they started in June and went through December. We started off by reviewing tree preservation codes from other cities, and it wasn't just from Oregon. We reviewed codes from Washington and California, Texas, Idaho, let's see where else, Washington, all over, in Texas, I think I mentioned that one, just to see how they preserved trees. And it's remarkable how each city seems to do it differently. We reviewed different applications from the city of Bend to see how they're preserving trees today. The applications were just a sample of how developments are preserving trees. We looked at different master plans. We looked at residential land divisions, mixed use developments, commercial developments, and they were more for illustrative or educational purposes. It wasn't to say this is exactly what's happening in the city of Bend. It was just to give us an idea and a way to play around with numbers of, if we were going to preserve this percent, what's it look like? Or if we're going to go down this path of preservation, what would it look like if we were to use these samples of the data? But it definitely wasn't how every single development would be preserving trees. We discussed options, and it was important to the committee that we provided flexibility and different options that a developer could use, because every site is so different when it becomes for preserving trees. Not every site's a housing development. Some of them are a mixed use development. Some of them are a commercial development. Some are lower or somewhat higher density. Some sites only have a couple trees versus 300 trees. So definitely needed some flexibility, and that was important to the committee. So we the committee established a flow chart, which we'll show in a couple minutes, and then discuss different options for mitigation. And then there was support for exempting some smaller sites from the preservation standards, simply because smaller sites are harder to develop in general. Not even when it comes to tree preservation, just because of setback standards and height restrictions and well, it used to be parking requirements, but that's not a thing anymore. Landscaping requirements and drainage requirements. So there's a lot of development standards that make smaller sites harder to develop, and then you put a layer on a tree preservation, and that's just one more thing. So the committee had a long discussion on what is the appropriate site to exempt from tree preservation. And when we say exempt, it doesn't mean that they don't have to preserve. They have the option to preserve. And if they choose not to preserve trees, they still have to mitigate. So they're not off the hook 100%. They can either preserve the trees or they have to mitigate. And that smaller site turned out to be in the recommendation of 1 acre or smaller. And then they talked about, they discussed that larger sites, which larger sites being 1 acre or larger than 1 acre, should preserve at least some trees on site before they just go to clear cutting. So it was important to the committee that a developer doesn't just go straight to clear cutting. So it was 5% was the minimum of preservation before they can opt to go to a discretionary path. So for the new commissioners, the clear and objective standards, when we talk about that, it's particularly for housing developments. Anytime there's housing being developed, we want to make sure that there's a clear and objective standard so that there's no discretion involved. And clear and objective means that it's very clear what is required of the applicant. So an example is at least 20% of the trees must be preserved. It's not may be preserved. And then a discretionary path, as you probably saw in your packet, is a developer has an option to go through a discretionary path and request that a discretion be applied. And in the example here, it's saying that less than 20% of the trees may be preserved if some constraints on the site make it feasible to comply with the objective criteria. But this gives the city it allows the city to apply discretion, and it may or may not be approved. So in this case, in the packet before you, we apply 3 clear and objective standards that a developer will be able to choose. And then they will also be able to apply for a discretionary path if they feel they meet one of the discretionary criteria, which we'll go through. And regardless, if they do go through that discretionary path, it's on the applicant to demonstrate how they feel that they meet that standard. So highlights of the proposed packet, the entire packet, not just TRUAC's recommendations, is there's several with any code update that I do, several new and revised definitions. In this case, we actually made some amendments to the chapter 1.3 for enforcement. We did some reorganization. I don't think that chapter's probably been touched since 2006. So we wanted to do some updates to it. In most cases, we update chapter 2.7, which is where all the master plans live, which we all know that chapter is just getting longer and longer with every master plan that we include. So we want to make sure that any reference to tree preservation is consistent. And then in 3.1, this was very minor, but we allow it today, and we just want to make sure it was consistent that street trees can be planted within 5 feet of a driveway or an alley. You see it all over town. It's been approved all the time. So we just want to make sure that that is standard since that's how they're being planted today. And then chapter 3.2 is where the bulk of the amendments are, and that's where the tree preservation standards live, as well as the additional street tree requirements and the new requirements for water efficient planter strip landscaping. Chapter 4.2, this is our minimum development standards review, site plan review, and design standards chapter. This is if someone comes in and they want to build a house or a duplex, they have to go through this process, or if they want to build a new commercial or mixed use development, this is the review process that they would go through. So the amendments to chapter 4.2 are pretty simple and straightforward, but we needed to update the submittal requirements for landscaping and street tree preservation. And then we added the new requirements for street trees and planter strip landscaping. And then in chapter 4.3, this is the process if someone wants to do a new land division, so create new lots or parcels. And we needed to update the submittal requirements again for tree preservation, street trees, and planter strip landscaping. And then in chapter 4.5, this is the process chapter if you want to create a new master plan. And very similar, we just need to update the tree preservation standards for this. We want to make it clear because a master plan typically allows a developer to come in and modify standards of the code, and we want to make sure that they can't modify the tree preservation standards, that they still have to comply with the preservation standards. So this term is going to be used throughout our discussion tonight, so I just wanted to put it up front. This is a new, well, it's actually in the code today, it's just not defined. So what is DBH? It's diameter at breast height, and it is how we are measuring trees. So diameter at breast height is at 4.5 feet above the ground, and that is the diameter. So when we talk about a regulated or priority tree, which we'll go through here in a minute, we'll talk about diameter at breast height, and that is the width of the tree at 4.5 feet above the ground. So currently in the Bend Development Code, what do we regulate? We regulate deciduous trees measured at 6 inches or larger at diameter of breast height, and then conifer trees at 10 inches or larger at 4.5 feet above the ground. So we actually measure them differently depending on the type of tree. And then what projects do we apply them to today? Land divisions and site plan review. And this is not changing. This recommendation is similar to what TRUAC is recommending today with land divisions and site plan review. So today, we review any new creation of lots or parcels, tree preservation standards apply, and at site plan review. And site plan review means like if a new commercial building gets developed or a new apartment complex gets developed, that means like 5 or more units gets developed. Or even if a new building is expanding 5,000 square feet or more, tree preservation standards apply. Today, a developer would have to submit a plan showing all trees 6 inches that are deciduous or 10 inches that are conifers, showing them being mapped and protected during construction unless they're being proposed for removal. And today they can propose them for removal if it is impractical to save them due to public streets, public utilities, housing, or other permitted uses. And that's why we see a lot of trees get removed today, because it's for the development of housing or utilities or streets. So the proposed amendments with TRUAC's recommendations, and this is a highlight specific to TRUAC, very high level TRUAC recommendations. As I go through the package of amendments, I'll make it clear what TRUAC did recommend. But their recommendation did, as I discussed, the minimum site size that would apply to is 1 acre. The applicable projects, similar to what is required today, is land divisions. So anytime someone creates a lot, new lots or parcels, and site plan review. So anything from 5,000 square feet additions, new apartments or commercial industrial developments, trees to be inventoried and mapped. So instead of it applying to different, conifers or deciduous trees, it's all trees, regardless of types, that are 6 inches at 4.5 inches or greater. So 6 inches DBH or larger. And then there will be options, that flexibility that I was talking about, preservation options that are clear and objective for regulated trees, which are the 6 inches or greater, or priority trees, which are the larger trees. Those would be the 20 inches or greater. Those are clear and objective. And then TRUAC also recommended a discretionary path, which I'll go into more detail on, as well as 2 mitigation options. One is for on-site tree replacement and one is for payment in lieu. So what is a regulated tree and what is a priority tree? So the regulated tree is the smaller tree. These are the ones that would be mapped and surveyed with any application. They're the 6 inches or larger. And then our priority tree, which today we call significant trees, a priority tree is 20 inches or larger, measured at 4.5 feet above the ground, 20 inches. The applicability today would apply to land divisions and site plan review applications. And it would also apply, so this is where we're diving into the code. Applications for developments on sites larger than 1 acre for single-family dwelling units as well as middle housing, so duplexes, triplexes, quads, and cottage cluster developments. And the reason being, this being added into the code is because that 1 acre, this gets confusing. So we're also amending the Bend code, and the Bend code is protecting properties from trees being removed prior to development. And we want to make sure that if there is a vacant piece of property out there, that a developer doesn't come in and it's a very large piece of property, that they just don't put a duplex on it and then cut all the trees down because they're a duplex, and then come in later and then do a land division. And they're way larger than an acre. So that acre is very important because TRUAC was, they said the acre or smaller is exempt from preserving trees. An acre or larger has preserved trees regardless of use. So the acre or larger, even if it's a duplex, has to preserve trees. Smaller than an acre is exempt. So the applicability then will be the land divisions, the site plan review applications, and anything larger than an acre if it has a single family dwelling, a duplex, triplex, quad, single room occupancy, or cottage cluster development. The exceptions to this, which is consistent with what we've talked about, is anything smaller than an acre. And this one is new. It's a site with 3 or fewer regulated trees may either comply with the tree preservation requirements or provide mitigation. And this one just came up. We've had a couple what we call pre-applications come in, and their applications, they come in with potential development ideas, and they only have 1 or 2 trees. Well, how do you, and they're right in the middle of the site. And how do you preserve 25% of 1 tree? And they don't qualify for discretionary path, and it would make development impractical, and there's no way to mitigate for 1 tree or 2 trees. And so we asked the planners, can you give us some examples of developments that have 1 or 2 trees? And they actually have quite a few examples. So we felt that adding this exemption of 3 or fewer regulated trees made sense to add to the code, based on the examples that they were able to provide us. So the applicability, similar to today, is the land division site plan review, and then the 1 acre for consistency, and then the 2 exceptions. The submittal requirements are going to be much clearer today in the draft than what we get today. It will include very clear. So when I was working on trying to provide examples for TRUAC, and I needed to get them site plans and data, it was very difficult to go through each application and try and find the site plan. Like, was it with their drainage plan or their grading plan, or where was their table? It was all over the place. So now it'll be very clear when an applicant submits their application, they will have a tree inventory. This is my hope. They will have a tree inventory table. They will have a tree preservation site plan. They will provide the tree preservation calculations, and they will provide tree replacement calculations. And on that tree inventory table, and a lot of applicants already do this today, it will include the number for each tree, the type, size, and proposed tree status. And if a tree, and TRUAC talked about this too, so we added it in. If a tree is clearly dead or diseased, it seems silly to make them have to go through a preservation standard for trees that are not healthy. And so they can propose to exempt the poor or very poor dead trees from the inventory if they have supporting documentation from ISA certified arborist. And I worked with our 2 arborists that were on TRUAC to make sure that this was used in other cities. I found very good examples from other cities that do this already, and they were very supportive of it and agreed that this is a normal practice and should be in the code. So if trees are dead, they should not have to save them, and they should not have to mitigate for them. So this is an option for a developer to propose if they want to go through the exercise. Then there's the tree preservation site plan. So they'll have the table, then they submit the site plan, which shows the improvements on the site, the location of the regulated trees, which is all trees that are 6 inches or larger, the status of the tree. So the ones that are proposed to be removed would likely have excess room. The ones proposed to be saved would not have the X's, and then the protection fencing. And then the calculations, basically showing the 20% or 25%, whatever they're proposing to preserve, which we'll get into on the next slide. And then if they are not able to meet the clear and objective standards, they would show the replacement calculations, how they're going to mitigate for what they are not able to preserve. So the preservation options, the clear and objective options are option one, they are able to preserve 20% of the priority trees. So they take all the priority trees on site and they're able to preserve 20% of those. Option two, they are able to preserve at least 25% of the total DBH of all regulated trees on site. So they take all the regulated trees on site, add them up, add up the DBH, and they preserve 25% of that. So it could be a variety of the trees on site. It could be some of the 20 inches, 24 inches, some smaller ones, and they save 25% of the total DBH. Or maybe they're only able to preserve 5 or 10% of the DBH and they want to mitigate for the rest of that up to 25%. That's your clear and objective options. And then if they're not able to preserve at least 5%, they can go through the discretionary path. And the discretionary track is only possible if they were able to show that they're not able to save the trees due to needing to meet block length and perimeter standards, connectivity standards. Maybe there's an arterial or collector street that's identified in our transportation system plan that they need to construct. There's utilities that are necessary due to existing or proposed utilities that cannot be relocated, or there's site topography that they need to address. But like I said before, it's on the burden's on the applicant to demonstrate why it is necessary for them to not be able to preserve at least 5% of the total DBH on site, because they need to meet one or more of these criterias. We added incentives in at the request of and support of TRUAC that are similar to the Southeast Area Plan incentives. They're more generous than what's in the code today. So there's incentives for reduction of setbacks, lot coverage, landscape coverage, as well as reduction to lot and parcel dimensions. So if a developer is able to preserve a little bit more of the total DBH or priority trees, they can have some incentives to development standards. The mitigation options are tree replacement on site. So if they're not able to preserve at least 25% of the total DBH on site, they will have to provide mitigation trees on site to make up for anything less than that required 25% DBH. And the way this works is you start deducting from the largest trees removed down to the smallest, and you add those DBHs up first. And so typically, start with the largest trees, working your way down, and your largest trees require the largest amount of replacement trees on site. And that, because there was an incentive to save the larger trees, so hopefully you save the larger ones, so you have less mitigation. And the larger trees require more mitigation, so a 20-inch tree would require 4 replacement trees. A tree between 10 and 19.9 inches is 2 trees, and then 6 inches to 19.9 is 1 tree. And a developer has the option to do either tree replacement on site or payment in lieu, or a combination. So some developers, they have a nice gateway into their development. They might want to plant some of their replacement trees in their gateway, and they might want to also do some payment in lieu of tree preservation. The amount that is being proposed for the payment in lieu of tree preservation is $600 per replacement tree. And that $600 will be reviewed by the city council at their June 20th meeting. And just to be clear, that's $600. So if it's a 20-inch tree, it's $600 times the 4 trees. And again, the city council will be reviewing that on their June 20th meeting. So this is the flow chart that the TRUAC kept working off of for the flexibility. So the hope is that the developers would look at preserving the largest trees. That's why the percent is the smallest. So preserve the priority trees, the 20 inches, 20% of those and you are completely done. If a developer is not able to do that, then they have the option of preserving 25% of the DBH of all the smaller trees. And if they're able to do that, then they're done. If they're not able to preserve 25% of the total DBH of the regulated trees, then they have the two options. They can do 5% of the total DBH and provide mitigation, or less than 5% and go through the discretionary process. Either way, they're going to be providing mitigation of the tree replacement and payment in lieu, and they would then be done. And all of this would apply to the 1 acre or more, this process. If you're less than an acre, you're still going to be providing the mitigation. The additional standards, and it was discussed a little bit by Trick, but there was support to make sure that whatever trees that a developer proposes to preserve, that the root protection zones are protected, because there's going to be saving those trees. This is just the exhibit that's going to be that's proposed to be in the draft. And so if a developer is proposing to protect the tree, they will have to put fencing around the root protection zone, which means that the encroachments can be no closer than 1/2 of the required root protection zone. And the zone is that outer limit, which is, there's a measurement that you have to do, and then there's a fencing requirement. And for consistency and the standards and specifications, we are updating the drawing to match this. So again, we're trying to be consistent, and even in the Bend code, in the municipal code, we're putting the same root protection zone requirements for tree preservation, so that all of it is consistent in the 3 different code requirements. And we talk about encroachments that are allowed, because there are some developments that can happen within that encroachment. And I worked with Portland, and I think it was Milwaukee, that do allow 25% of that area to have encroachments in it, which seems to be fairly common practice. So that you will see in the code. And then the question came up quite a bit from the public of what happens after a development is done. And a developer identifies trees to be preserved and they are moved off the site. How do we know that the trees will still be preserved? So in the code, we added tree preservation conditions of approval. So the 3 bullets, and these are abbreviated, but there's 3. There's trees identified for preservation. So this one addresses preserving trees for 3 years. From either the date of the land division final plats or the building final inspection, whichever occurs first. So if a tree is identified for preservation, it basically has to be preserved for 3 years and kept alive. If it's a replacement tree and it dies within the first 3 years, they just have to put it back. Then the 3 years would start over. And there's another option that if a developer puts in a tracker easement, there's some conditions of approval for its longevity in a tracker easement. So these are 2 additional requirements that'll be in the code. They don't have to do with tree preservation necessarily, but they do have to do with trees and landscaping. So additional proposed amendments for street trees. So one of the trade-offs is that because we are not requiring tree preservations for single family dwellings, duplexes, triplexes, quads, on lots 1 acre or less, that they would have to put in street trees, because today they don't even have to put in street trees. They don't even have preserved trees. And there was, I think, some support from TRUAC on this. So the new requirement is that these uses would have to put in street trees when there is an existing sidewalk or a sidewalk is being required with development. So we see a lot of infill projects going in where they are putting in the duplex triplexes. And so we'll, if this gets adopted, they will be required to put in street trees. And what we are also doing with this project, and we worked with a lot of different arborists and landscapers and different departments within the city, is we updated the street tree list, which currently resides in the Bend Development Code and has a very small number of trees that you can choose from, maybe 12. It has over 70 now, and we're going to relocate it from the Bend Development Code to an appendix to the standards and specs. And that way, as new trees come available, or there's pests and we want to remove a tree from the street tree list, we don't have to go through this process. We can just add it to the list and use those trees. And so it'll be an appendix to the standards and specifications, and that will be reviewed and approved by the council on June 20th as well. And we will be uploading that list because we've been getting a lot of questions for it. Hopefully tomorrow we'll be able to add that to the city webpage, so there'll be access to it so people can view that list. And again, there's a number of trees on there that we're even going to be able to include ponderosas on that list, as long as the planter width is 10 feet wide or larger. And the new street trees will be based on the planter width versus forget what's on now, but we did worked with like I said, a lot of different departments and landscapers on it, and so that is being proposed. And the other big one is landscaping in the planter strip. So the planter strip is that area between the sidewalk and the right of way. And we have, I know they're here.
We're back here.
Okay. Lori and Dan are in our utilities department and have been overseeing this new 2021 water conservation management plan requirement. And they have their own council goals that they work under to meet for water conservation. And because I was updating the code for the street trees, and this landscaping falls in the same area, council has a goal to eliminate turf in the same area. We felt that it was appropriate, and we had a work session with council, and they were supportive of including it in this package of amendments to eliminate and make it clear that turf is not allowed in the landscape strip. So it's in the proposed package of amendments, and this will apply for developments with a new sidewalk or planter strip, or with the planting of new street trees. So anytime new street trees will be required, then this new requirement for water efficient landscaping will go in. And just like the street trees being an appendix to the standards and specs, there will be a new list of plants. There's hundreds of plants that they worked with the landscaper on, and templates that a developer could use as well. With ornamental grasses, shrubs, and plants that will be an appendix to the City of Bend standards and specs that will also be hopefully uploaded tomorrow for the public to look at, and the council will review and approve that, or review it on June 20th. And the code will prohibit the installation of turf and inefficient spray and irrigation. There's additional requirements for this that will be in the City of Bend standards and specs that go into way more detail about the irrigation and the overspray requirements that will be here. And something to point out too, this is the only part of the Bend Development Code that even if the Planning Commission recommends approval of City Council and City Council approves it, it will not go into effect till November 1st, given their timeline that they're under. So the landscaping and the prohibiting turf won't go into effect till November 1st. All the other code for tree preservation and street trees would go into effect in August 18th, I believe it is, or 16th. Almost done. So the public outreach for the tree preservation started back in April of 2023. We've had a webpage that we've kept updated for the tree code update since then. We've held TRUAC meetings between June through December. We held 2 hybrid informational sessions with the public on March 7th and March 12th. We emailed the proposed draft on May 3rd to over 300 people, probably almost 400 people now, who are very interested in the proposed code amendments. And then for Lori and Dan's update to the for the water efficient planter landscaping requirements, they've had a group that they've been working with, and they've shared it with utility public advisory groups, the Oregon Landscaper Contractors Associations, COBA, Harmony Farms, Avian Water, and the Bend Development Code Update Group, as well as local nurseries. I have a couple additional amendments, so when the draft is posted tomorrow, these will be included in there. A couple amendments I just need to make to the definitions. I realize there's a typo in my regulated tree definition. Someone brought it to my attention under tree preservation that if we are going to allow encroachments, like new structures, impervious surfaces and utilities, it's most likely there's going to be some clearing and grading. So we have to make it clear that happens. Under new landscaping, there is this is not consistent 100% with the CFEC rules, totally kind of still has to do with trees, but I just need to clean up this red part. A tree planted and disconnected individual planter does not count towards the canopy requirements. I know this is kind of weird, but I just need to strike it and I just want to bring it to commission's attention. I received some feedback on the submittal requirements. So site plan review already today requires irrigation plans, but at a very high level. So if a commercial building comes in, and we're looking at their landscaping requirements at a very high level to make sure they're meeting 20 or 15% landscaping requirements and that they have their parking lots, trees, and those kind of items. But we're not looking at what kind of drip system they have and what kind of sprinkler fixtures they have. And so I think I carried over this irrigation plan identifying the material, size, and location of all components and irrigation systems from Dan's chapter 12 into here, and I shouldn't have, so I just need to strike that. So that will not be in the draft. And then for the master plan chapter, I want to make sure that for existing site conditions, because when we talk about master plans, we're talking about very, very, very large projects. And a lot of times when it comes to existing site conditions, we get aerials, photos of the existing landscaping, and I want to make sure that that's a submittal item that they can do. So I just want to highlight that we're going to continue to accept those aerial photos. And a lot of times in master plans, when they do tree preservation, that they include them in their open space areas because we already require 10% open space. And I want to make it clear that they can include their tree preservation in those open space areas. So there'll be additional amendments for that. So the next steps is our planning commission hearing next Monday. And then the city council hearing on Thursday, June 20th. And then the city council second reading will be July 17th because they will not have their normally scheduled meeting the first week of July. And then the effective date of most of the code update, if all goes as planned, is August 16th. Like I said, just the no turf and the planter strip landscaping will be effective November 1st. So I can answer any questions about the code update. And then Jeff is here if you have questions about the TRUE Act process, TRUE Act process, and follow up on that. And then Lori and Dan, if you have questions about the water efficient landscaping.
Thank you. I'm sure we all have some questions. Jeff, since you're online, do you want to start?
Yeah, I had a comment and a question. Pauline, hello. The 3.1.500, the clear vision allowing street trees was kind of troubling to me, especially you made the comment that ponderosa pines would be allowed there. And has a consideration been given to limb height, limbing those trees up?
So, and Dan better than I can. So, ponderosa pines will be allowed within outside of 5 feet. But in addition to that one standard in the standards and specs, there's a lot of other requirements for trees in those areas, including site distance requirements and what's the other term, Dan? It's like site and angle distance requirements, so that even though they can be within 5 feet of a driveway, there's other requirements that they may not be allowed there.
And up to a certain height too, so
Yeah.
the limbing up requirement, I think it has to be clear up to trying to find it, but
10 feet or whatever. Yeah, whatever that.
Yeah, there's a lot of requirements.
So the, the clear vision code, as I recall it, deals a lot with the corner on a block, let's say 20 feet off the corner on each side. I just hate to see street trees, block that clear vision corridor.
Right.
We didn't have a chance to look at anything you're proposing for chapter 12 because that goes to council. I'm just wondering if sleeves under the sidewalk for irrigation and maybe under driveway aprons or, have been thought about to be allowed, required.
Jeff, there's a web page that I saw today for the updates to the standards and specs, and I'll send it to you tomorrow so that you
Okay.
can look at that. And then June 20th is when council will be reviewing the changes to that portion of the standards and specs.
Okay.
If you have questions on that, I will give you a contact for Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Pauline. That's all I have.
So just a couple of things. One is, you mentioned about the root protection zone, and we already have provisions in the development code for when there's grading to make sure that the roots aren't disturbed during construction. So I assume that we do, so we don't encroach on the big trees that when we're doing the development. Is that true? So one of the things we'll see sometimes is they'll leave a bunch of big ponderosas, and then a year or two later, you start seeing them die from the top down because the roots got damaged during the construction process. So even though they saved the trees and it takes 5 years for them to die, they eventually die because there was damage
Yeah.
that was done during construction.
I'd say, Suzanne, based on the existing language in the code, we do say that any trees that are proposed to be retained on site need to be protected. We're adding a lot of specificity in the code going forward about exactly what that means. We'll be doing a planning inspection to make sure all the protection fencing is where it needs to be around the root protection zone. So I have a lot of confidence that that process will play out with more
And
protection.
signage.
More protection in the future, just by what we've learned, and having the objective criteria about what goes into protecting those trees too.
Okay.
Taller fencing, and there will be signage required with contact information, because today I think it's kind of lax. There is stuff being stored inside the root protection
Right.
zone. So I think
Right.
there will be more eyes on the root
A
protection.
lot more
Mhm.
damage.
Yeah.
My other question is about the arborist saying that this is a tree that is dying or damaged, because I feel like we've had a fair amount of that in previous applications that had come before us, and I feel like, since we live in a desert, and we have a fairly dry climate, and there are even trees that have been here historically aren't getting the same amount of water that they would have gotten in the past. So an arborist could make a case for probably, I don't know, some ridiculously large percentage of the trees in Bend that they are damaged or sick. We saw that, and we've seen it on almost any proposal that we've had. There's been an arborist report saying that the trees were, that we couldn't save them because of that. So I that worries me that there's an out there. I appreciate that there are professionals that are out there evaluating the trees to make sure that they're healthy and that they're going to serve our community. But I just feel like I don't know, that worries me that we are putting that back in there with that an arborist could say, well, you don't have to preserve this because it's stressed.
We had a pretty healthy discussion around that, and I think absent a requirement to mitigate, that would be probably a greater risk, but right up until this, these proposed codes are enacted, there's no requirement whatsoever to replace, so.
Right.
Hand in hand, that certainly, I think, adds some comfort that we've got to start somewhere, right? And coming out of it, Most of the feedback we've gotten is either it's too harsh or it's not harsh enough, which is probably a sign that it's something
The right spot.
close to something to at least start with. Heard, and that was definitely part of our discussion. And of course, we lay over this whole thing that we think there should be some sort of urban forestry function, which was outside our group scope, but that was another, strong majority, if not unanimous belief that there's an opportunity for a growing city like Bend to have, urban forestry as input to how we manage the urban canopy.
And that arborist has to be an ISA certified arborist, so it's an extra level.
Okay.
And when I talked to the two arborists that were on our committee, they were adamant that it would be an ISA certified arborist, because they have a different code of ethics that they felt strongly would, one, know what poor and very poor dead is, and that they would, if it actually meets that, then the supporting documentation that they have to include would be,
Okay. Okay.
And I'll just add to what Jeff said, about resources for the city. We are looking at that to see if we can, have an employee. We're looking at eventually bringing in an employee to help with a variety of things related to landscaping. And one of them would have would be the desire to have some type of certifications for that type of review, to give us a resource that, we have control over
Right.
to be able to review a
Right.
third party assessment.
And so the mapping of the forest canopy, so like that'd be a good job for this person, but shy of that, there is a program. If the state doesn't, I can't remember what you said, that
Oh,
was
yeah.
the Department of Forestry was gonna have something to map, but we have something that we have done, will do. Where are we in terms of mapping?
we're waiting to see if ODF's program is going to be something we can use. So just kind of waiting on them.
Okay.
And we should hear from them fairly soon.
Okay.
Is your understanding that would be free of charge then for the city
my
to use that?
understanding.
Because there are options, of course, to hire somebody to map that for us, but if we can get
And
that
then
data.
I did, I
no
have an
cost.
email, I just haven't gotten to it about a grant, so.
Yeah.
I'll look at that tomorrow.
Cool. So I have three questions, and hopefully I'll get through them right order in my brain. So the first one is, I think this is the first time we've heard a number put onto the in lieu of fee. Could you talk a little bit more of how we came to that number and why it's $600?
So I worked with a couple departments within the city. They looked at cost of trees, staff time to purchasing the tree, planting the tree, the irrigation to put in the tree, the maintenance of the tree. And that sum came to 600. We compared it to other cities' fees, which was, it basically mirrored what they were doing as well. And so we felt we were within the ballpark at the 600.
So it's kind of an idea between like, instead of mitigating this on site, it's like a per tree replacement somewhere else in the city
Yes.
to like kind of make those roughly, the end result is the same in terms of from a city's perspective, I guess.
Yep, and the idea is if we get this mapping going, then we can see where there's areas in the city that are lacking trees, then we can grow the canopy.
Cool urban canopy program. I would love it. That would be amazing. My other question is about what happens after if we implement this code. So for example, a similar situation, and don't want to actually compare these two things in that kind of a way, but last year when we implemented the camping code, well, 2 years ago when we implemented the camping code, we had a reevaluation of how that went and like minor modifications to the code, like coming from like things that we learned from implementation. Are we looking to do something like that with the tree code?
So I will compare it to accessory dwelling units.
It was a bad comparison.
So in my experience, what we usually we'll watch something for like a year or two and we'll get feedback or, notice things that need a little tweaking here and there. Either it's too restrictive or too flexible, and we'll make changes as we go through. And it could be something simple, so I'll just plug it in with other code updates. Or if it's so noticeable. And one of the things that TRUAC recommended to council, which I think council was already supportive of, is watching which option is used the most. And maybe it's all the options are used equally, but if one is used so frequently, that's telling us maybe we need to revisit. Is everyone just going straight to mitigation and they're still cutting all the trees down? Then we'll have to revisit and maybe update the code. So
Either.
it is possible that there might be some changes, but we have to get something in place that's better than what we have today.
Yeah,
So that we can see what needs fixed.
give them a clear.
And there may be some aspects that we won't really be able to tell the impact of it for many months, if not a
Yeah.
year or two, because as developments come through, they won't be subject to these new regulations until August, and then,
Right.
it takes time to go through the land use and permitting process, so it will take some time to actually play out.
But quantifiable things like, were these incentives used, and if so, which ones?
Yeah.
What's a percentage of DBH that was reliably,
Yeah.
preserved?
And then my final question is for Trek, and it's more of a, so from the prompt, the goal here was to balance the need to preserve trees with building needed housing. What kind of conversations did you guys have to strike that balance, as I guess?
It was a really impressively diverse group with a lot of opinions and a lot of different experiences. And I think one of the reasons we went from 5 meetings to 9 meetings was we all had some learning to do. Everyone learned from the arborists first. And then we learned from each other about the perspectives. Not everybody on the committee is a homeowner, not everybody is a builder or has had to choose to preserve or not preserve a tree to get a housing unit in the ground. And so I think while we were unanimous in a number of things, there was a healthy disagreement. Very few of the votes of what we actually proposed were unanimous. There were, we have 13 voting members, so there are a lot of 5 to 8 or 6 to 7 sort of votes, which made folks on the committee both uncomfortable and also helped us see that we were probably at least facilitating something that was productive, because we had an assignment to give a recommendation, not to say, sorry, we couldn't decide. It was too hard.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Bob.
Very well done. Thank you. Thank you to all of Trek. I was really encouraged to see the emphasis on having a certified arborist, ISA, is that? ISA.
Yep.
Involved in a lot of these efforts and determinations and recommendations. But I was a bit confused in chapter 1.2, the definitions, the qualified professional individual states that for the purposes of preparing the restoration or tree protection plans, an individual who through related training, or on-the-job experience, or both, possesses knowledge in one of the following subject areas. Arboriculture, never heard that term before. Natural resources, including water resources and riparian restoration, and urban interface fire protection. I'm calling that out. It's on page 4, again, under qualified professional, so it's alphabetical, so Q. Because that seems to have a more relaxed standard for who's qualified. In other words, Joe or Jane, who's been in the field for 20 years, could say, hey, I've gotten smart doing my job. I can, make an informed assessment and plan, which doesn't seem consistent with the higher standard of ISA. So either that's in.
So the only time, there's a couple areas where ISA is identified, but for the submittal requirements, it's either the qualified professional or surveyor that would have to submit the tree inventory or the site plan. If they want to go through the route of identifying a tree as poor or very poor, then they have to go through the ISA certified arborist. And there was
Okay.
one other section.
So it's just for identifying the trees on the site that you need, that it
Right.
has to be somebody that
The
knows
location
what a
and
tree
size
is.
and
You wanted to-
status.
Okay. that-
If you
Okay.
wanted to remove a tree from the list. Like you need to have the higher standard. Is that?
Right. Right,
Okay.
That's the way I
from the
understand
site.
If
not
that's
from
the case,
from the
then
site.
then I'm good.
There's one other section.
Yeah, it did come out in a couple of areas, the ISA requirement. I can't recall right now, it's just flagging it earlier and I wasn't making that connection.
That was, so one of our
Like
committee
that.
members is a professional engineer with a survey company. And so that was part of the discussion was what does it really look like when you go out? How hard is it? And if the standards change, what incrementally, how much harder or more expensive is it? Because that's the, undue burden standard that we want to try to avoid while as far as protecting the addition of housing units. So it was, we had some,
Yeah.
we had some just squirming
You
and
don't
some
want that-
discussions
that-
around that.
Hire a heart surgeon to go out and do a site map.
Right.
Anyone?
Take a blood pressure reading.
So I have a few questions. First, thank you again, both of you. For the
Thank you.
presentation.
Yeah.
Committee member.
It's nice to get my memory refreshed. from many meetings. So, on page 21 of the draft,
Mhm.
there's, a line that says, no trees subject to this section may be removed prior to a final land use decision or final decision of the review authority. So I know we talked about clear cutting, right? Is this line to address that? And so if someone does remove trees, what are the implications? It doesn't say that they're, or does it, I guess my question is, does it need to say anything about the consequences if they take that action?
I would say that would go to the code enforcement in chapter 1.3,
Okay,
right, Ian?
Correct.
Okay.
okay,
Any violation is a code violation subject to enforcement in the generally applicable.
Yeah.
Enforcement section in chapter 1.
so you don't have to call out the hammer here.
Not every time.
The intent with putting that clause in the development code was to ensure that if the developer submitted a tree inventory plan, everything looked good, it made sense. And we were reviewing, or say they wanted to go down the exemption route and say these 8 trees are dead and they shouldn't be counted towards my overall percent that I need to preserve. That they didn't just go and then remove them the next day, that we
Right.
carried out through the land use process and permitting process, and if trees were approved for removal, that was done at the appropriate time. So it's kind of a catch.
I remember at one of our,
Catch-all there.
at one of the public meetings of the two that were held, someone asked the question about what if someone cuts a bunch of trees before they submit a plan?
Yeah. And that's where the consistency is also being cleaned up in the Bend Code Title 16. That council will be reviewing. That addresses tree preservation prior to development.
Okay.
Whereas the Bend Development Code addresses tree preservation during development
Okay.
applications.
Which is why we don't see anything about it here.
Yes.
Okay.
Could you speak further to that? So the scenario where somebody buys 20 acres, has a lot of trees. There's no official plan underway and it's
I would love to. I have learned so much. The Bend Code, so, and this will be posted tomorrow. The Bend Code, we are creating a new chapter called 16.40, and you'll see this tomorrow. And it's called Tree Preservation Performance Standards. And that performance standard is going to say regulated trees, so it's used the same term, 6 inches or greater cannot be cut down. Unless you have a development application. If you have a development application, then you get into the Bend Development Code. So if you're 20 acres, you can't remove trees until you have a development application.
Right, so again, one of council's objectives with this work effort was to increase consistency between the Bend Code, Title 16, and the Development Code. So that there wasn't that disconnect of what happens to a property before development's proposed, or just any person owning property who may never actually propose any development, but still has a site large enough where regulated trees are to be preserved. So trying to increase the consistency so that more or less the same regulations apply whether someone's proposing development or not.
And we're fine tuning it today,
Yeah.
tomorrow, so.
I had a question. Can you guys hear me?
Oh, Scott.
Yes.
Hi. In terms of the tree inventory and everything, you know, a lot of the property that's getting added into Bend through urban growth boundary, it's not necessarily, I guess I'm just kind of wondering, when does that tree become the responsibility of the city? Because if we've identified urban growth boundary areas, but they're not technically in the city yet, you have a developer that has a considerable portion of land. You know, when we get these master plans to bring that area officially, I guess, into the city, by that time they kind of know which trees they want to get rid of. And I guess, is there an opportunity for those trees to get chopped down before they officially become part of the city? Between the urban growth boundary and then the actual annexation, I guess.
Are you talking about the properties that are in the urbanizable area?
Well,
So-
I'm like, I guess once an area gets you know, for our next urban growth boundary, we're going to identify areas around Bend, and then we say, okay, these areas are now within the urban growth boundary. At that moment, are those trees kind of inventoried and protected? Because if I do a master plan of an area, you know, and I'm laying out streets and this and that and trying to figure out what we're going to do before we come to the city with it, I could potentially just get rid of the trees that I know I want to get rid of beforehand, right?
So I can answer that one. So there's an area that's between the city limits and the urban growth boundary. So like in 2016, when we expanded the urban growth boundary, that created the urbanizable area. And that area is covered by what's called the Joint Management Agreement. And that's a intergovernmental agreement between the city of Bend and Deschutes County. And Deschutes County is essentially told, or let the city of Bend apply their regulations within that area even before it's annexed. And so, and then they also adopted the UA zoning district into their code. So it is sort of like joint jurisdiction, but the city of Bend sort of staffs it and has the authority through the county to do that. And so we do have tree preservation regulations within the urbanizable area, and the joint management agreement gives the city staff the authority to enforce it. So once the urban growth boundary is, I guess, adopted and acknowledged, then that applies. So I mean, obviously, if we do a future expansion, until that future expansion is in place, the Deschutes would apply. But as soon as it is in place, we go to the joint management agreement.
And there's standards in that urbanizable area now, and the county is doing an update, which anytime we update that one part of the code, we have to go to the county and update the codes between the council and the county. And because I have to do a code update with them, we're going to carry whatever gets adopted here into that area at that time. So end of this year, beginning of next year.
Okay. Great.
Any other questions, Scott?
I guess just a kind of general background in terms of the TRUE Act discussions. And this is my personal preference is kind of would probably lean towards more of an environmental update to the code as opposed to tree preservation. I know that there were a lot of things that were added. The no turf in the planting strip is great. We live in a desert. There's no need to have lawn in those areas. But I was just wondering if, like, I mean, species, that's kind of a big one that I guess TRUE Act decided not to really get into. And then also just like kind of a general water consumption of an area, gallons per minute per square foot or per acre or something like that, if that was ever discussed as a way to, or as part of this update.
We had a healthy discussion around species, especially junipers. I think what we learned was that junipers are highly drought resistant. They're native to the area now for the last few millennia. And at the same time, they are a thirsty tree. So when given water, they will drink it. And so that's out in the Badlands, juniper does fine, doesn't eat a lot, but when it's next to a canal and all of a sudden it's, this big around, maybe that's drinking more than its fair share of water. So I will say that was a discussion. That was one of those uncomfortable, head nods around the group where we weren't fully in agreement one way or the other. And so ended up being that juniper just falls under, it's still a tree that would fall under this regulation.
And Scott, I think Truac also talked about should we require for species of tree replacement, and ended up not going that route for a variety of reasons. One, maybe it's just not the best adapted tree for that site, and so don't want to replicate it, and would leave that flexibility to the developer. We'll see how that works.
Yeah, was there a discussion about kind of overall water usage at all? And like touching on more landscape aspects besides trees?
It wasn't strictly from a water consumption standpoint. I'm sorry, did we have, this is related to?
Scott, this is Dan. I could
Can
speak to
you-
the landscape.
We just need you on the microphone, Dan. Do you mind introducing your full name? Or you just want to go by just Dan?
Dan, Dan the water main.
Hi, Scott. Dan Denny, Water Conservation Manager. So from the landscape perspective, we did look and prioritize plants that were either moderate to very low water use. We looked at plant communities, so species that work well together in the natural environment, but also, didn't want to be too constrictive in the number of species, obviously for plant diversity and that sort of thing. But yeah, we did kind of backwards engineer the water use for these landscapes and kind of what we wanted to drive them to long-term for our water reduction goals. So that was considered.
And to be clear, that's for the plantings in the planter strip, Scott. I'm not sure if your question was about Truac's discussion and private site development or not.
Yeah. I've just sometimes being on the design side of things, I know that oftentimes developers will just say, just do one. It's easier. No maintenance, or I guess low maintenance. You could just spray fertilizer on it and mow it, and you don't have to have someone come out and prune and maintain and things like that. I just, we live in a desert, and I walk around and I see a lot of turf, and I just kind of wonder if there was any discussion about, I guess, regulation in terms of water usage per size, and maybe not necessarily single family, but larger developments, things like that.
So I think, Scott, that would be in the future, looking at the private side and looking at water use per site. Right now, we're addressing that through our educational and outreach and, our evaluations of those water use on site. We started in the right of way because it's kind of twofold benefit for us as far as decreasing water waste that makes it into the streets or storm drains, because those are troublesome, oddly shaped areas. So number one, reducing the water need of the landscape material in there, but also increasing the efficiency of the irrigation system so they don't produce that overspray. Looking into the future, that's certainly something we have the capability of doing. I mean, we obviously create water budgets for customers to track water use and that sort of thing, but not necessarily for this right-of-way portion of the language. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I was thinking more for like the entire site, not necessarily
Right.
for the planting strip.
Yep.
But if someone owns someone owns 20 acres, they can just use as much as they can afford, right?
Yeah, right now, we don't have any regulations for the private side.
And is it, Scott, I don't know if I'm speaking out of turn, so Renee, but TRUAC, what Dan's talking about wasn't part of the TRUAC mission, right? So we have
Yeah.
two efforts coming together here that's moving forward. And so the water consumption wasn't within the purview of the TRUAC
Right.
committee. That's in Dan's
Yeah.
ballpark. Thanks, Dan.
Sure.
So I have a couple more questions. When we were talking about the ISA certified arborists, so will there be a list of those individuals available, or it's just up to people to Google it and figure out who? Okay. So my last question deals with the condition of land use approval. And so when the land division occurs and a tree that has been preserved, right, part of the preservation plan, it then becomes the responsibility of the property owner and must be preserved for a minimum of 3 years. So, I mean, I'll just say personally, I'm really disappointed in that. It feels short-sighted to me. So a lot of effort has gone into creating the preservation plan, right? And deciding, in my opinion anyway, deciding which trees to be preserved. And then to say, there's just a 3-year clock on it. I was really hopeful that it would be a lot longer than that. And so how was the 3-year? And was there a discussion about if a tree had been slated for preservation, is there maybe a process in place that if you're going to take out a tree that was part of the approved preservation plan, then you need another level of approval or something to take that tree down? I don't know. To me, it felt like it was preserved and there it is, but it's not.
Well, we pulled examples from a lot of different cities and they ranged a lot of different varieties. 3 was probably the bare minimum of years. There was 5 years. There was covenants that could be recorded on properties. And this was probably like the happy medium that we came up with of the 3. Ian might want to talk a little bit more about why we picked this one.
Yeah, I think Pauline's right. Different cities, excuse me, use a different variety of different tools to do this. We did talk to at least one city, I'm not gonna name them or it, that used the covenant approach that said we don't actually enforce this. And that's one reason we didn't go the covenant route, because that would be something that the city would have to enforce in circuit court. And to be honest, we just can't do that.
Right.
That's not something we can do. We don't have the resources to do that. Another consideration, and this is probably my thinking. I don't know that this was reflected in what other cities shared with us, but in terms of the number of years, I mean, we are a couple things. We're focused on new development, right? So is it, I'll say, fair and reasonable to impose this obligation on most of the time the first people who are going to buy and live in that new house? We're talking about residential development. I mean, ultimately, this is a decision for council to make, but I think it is not unreasonable to say if you're buying this new house, it's subject to these new standards. There's a condition that runs with the land that requires that the preserved trees be preserved for 3 years. That's not an unreasonable obligation, I didn't think. Now, if we start talking about 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, longer period of time, you may have multiple people cycling through that property. And frankly, they're going to have, in most cases, no awareness of what the land use conditions of approval are or were, or maybe still are, if we used a term like 5 or 10 or 15 years. That's not particularly realistic to expect people to know what those are and stick to them. And then third or fourth, maybe, to your question about whether there was a consideration of a system that would require somebody to proactively go get some approval to take a tree that had been required to be protected down, and you didn't say permit, but I'll say permit. That was sort of, I think, thoughtfully or intentionally excluded from the scope of this project, which was focused on preservation and development, and that's because so far, there's been a kind of a collective decision made that this project was not going to encompass or include sort of a tree removal permit aspect for sort of the years down the road. Some cities do have that, I mean, we sometimes talk about, we say, oh, that's a new program. That really is a new program. And honestly, sometimes those systems are used for, I won't say nefarious purposes, but neighbor to neighbor purposes that maybe don't have that much to do with tree preservation, but have more to do with beef from neighbor to neighbor. So we expressly chose to not really get into that topic or that program through these changes that are really focused on the development code, focused on development. And that doesn't mean that Ben never could explore that, but that was really outside of the scope of this project. So yeah, that's a long way of saying this was a compromise. And there is a little bit of it feels reasonable. Last thing I'll add, I think that once focusing on new development again, once lots are platted, they're built, they're sold, people are in those houses. I mean, I think the economic and other intrinsic and intangible value of having trees around most of the time is going to be an incentive for people to preserve them. I mean, I know when we had to take a tree out of our, small property, it sucked, but we had to do it. I think most people, once those trees are up and thriving, they're going to want to keep them. So I'm hoping that's not too naive, but we're hoping that's a factor too, and that realistically we don't see people waiting for that 3-year clock to wind down so they can start taking trees out of the house that they, presumably just moved into and is still new. And we hope that's what will happen.
Just trying to imagine the person that's doing
But
that.
they're probably out there, but yeah, it's a little indistinct, but those were some of the thoughts that went into that.
Okay. And just for clarification, properties 1 acre and less are exempt, correct? But they have the option to participate or to follow the guidelines, but they have to do mitigation.
Correct.
Okay. So when people call and say, oh my gosh, on an infill situation, a neighbor's cutting trees, right, in their lot, and they're freaking out about it. Mitigation is required for those trees that are being
Depends
cut.
what they're doing. So the applicability is a land division, regardless of size.
Okay,
Or first, let's just start with land division, site plan review. And if you're doing a house, a townhome, or a duplex, triplex, that's 1 acre or larger. The exceptions are the 1 acre or less for a land division or site plan review. So 1 acre or less, they can remove the trees, but they have to mitigate.
right.
Or remember, if there's 3 or fewer, they can just take them out. They have to mitigate.
But only.
But if it's a duplex on 1 acre or less, they can just take trees out.
And they don't have to mitigate.
Right.
Okay, but for a single family home, they would have to mitigate.
Not if it's an acre or less.
Okay,
We're-
so,
Because we need to treat single family homes the same as duplex, triplex, quad,
right.
it's just a mouthful. So we've been trying to say single family and middle housing, so all that gets lumped together in the code every time it's
Okay.
mentioned.
So, and I'm just making sure because I've heard questions asked about this, and so I just want to make sure. If there's a lot across the street from me, And if that lot was purchased and the trees were all cleared, it's less than an acre, that's okay.
If it's for a single family.
If it's for a
or
single
middle
family
housing.
home.
But if it's for 5 or more units,
It's not okay.
Why the distinction?
Right.
because 5 or more units falls under site plan review. So site plan
Okay,
review.
Site plan review is the.
Oh, so
I was
site plan
gonna say
review
that-
covers it.
Right, but they can so let's look up on the screen. So what this applies to is land division, site plan review. Or single family and the middle housing, 1 acre or more.
Yep.
The exceptions are. Remember the small properties,
Mhm.
1 acre or less for the land divisions or site plan review, they can remove the trees, but they have to mitigate. Only for land division, site plan review.
So if
The-
you just wanna take down a tree in a single family lot, there's no mitigation, there's no permit, there's no requirement, there's no regulation.
For an acre or
For an
less.
acre or less.
And do either of you remember what the vote was on? If this should apply to 1 acre or less? I think it was one of those close votes.
Yeah, it was.
It was because there was a motion for 2 acres and there was a motion for half acre.
Mhm.
And then this was one of those, okay, revote.
Yes,
And it came up.
You know, not being a quasi judicial blah, blah, blah meeting, it was, you know, a little less formal trying to facilitate it, but it started at 2 acres and half an acre and ended at 1 acre is the punchline.
I don't remember the exact vote though.
Yeah, I remember it was close and I remember it came up at a second meeting. Someone asked for a revote on it. So,
So I've got a question slash concern. Not so much with the code, but
Mhm.
then Pauline, you mentioned we gotta start somewhere and then we'll be accumulating data, and if there are refinements as we learn how it's doing, then we can amend things going forward. I could envision a scenario where the development community is really great and they're preserving you know, the priority trees, which I think is the overarching priority.
yes.
And if they can't do that, they're doing the 25% of the regulated trees. That the community in general is not fast tracking to mitigation. Bare minimum 5% and replacement trees or fee in lieu. However, if there is a developer or a couple of developers who see things differently and their business model, or for whatever reason, they over a series of developments or on every development, they're just going basically clear cutting, say 5% and saying, you know, checks in the mail. What then?
I mean, first we have to see how the code plays out, so it's hard to say how scenarios are gonna play out. We're gonna have to track and see what options are being used and go from there.
Right, at a macro level.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep, and then get council direction, you know, if they are hearing concerns, then we go through the process. So it, like Renee said, it's gonna take 1 year, 2, 3 years to see how this plays out. It's not gonna happen overnight.
And although as TRUAC was coming up with the different clear and objective tracks and then ultimately the discretionary option, there was a focus on, based on council direction, how can we incentivize someone to save the large trees? So that, you know, formed that discussion and that ultimate recommendation. But we won't know, and the developer doesn't have to tell us how many other scenarios they tried, you know, going down this, what we've been calling like a flow chart. It doesn't have to actually operate like a flow chart. They might run a couple different scenarios complying with the 20% of priority or 25% of all regulated trees. Some might go straight to 5% and mitigate. We won't know that unless we ask and, you know, they tell us the reasons why, which that would be good information to know. So it's not as though they have to step through every option before they get to the mitigate, right? They can do that. And that was through a lot of discussion and compromise with TRUAC of how to provide both clear and objective options that offer flexibility, knowing every site's unique. We do need kind of a relief valve on the discretionary track, so.
Yeah, my
We just
concern
won't
is,
know.
I mean, just net it out, people not operating in good faith, right? The community has spoken, you know, in terms of what the priorities, a lot of hard work of TRUAC, city council, coming up with amended code, yet there are sites that a reasonable person might assess, lend themselves to preservation. Yet the developer says, the hell with it, I'm just doing it in clear cutting because that's my business model.
Right, I mean, in all fairness, that can happen more or less today, and we're not getting any mitigation.
has.
So,
Oh, no, this is a big improvement.
yeah.
It's,
That's the issue.
it's, you know, the bad apple is the,
Mhm.
you know, the bad actor. That's, I mean, maybe that's, you know, if it improves, you know, 95%, then worry about the 5% down the road.
This seems like one of those, the perfect is the enemy of the good, and that having something in place, because we have nothing is gonna be
Yeah.
better, and if. we
Yeah, I
can
don't want to
learn and
overcomplicate this. I agree
Right.
100%, Suzanne, but yeah, just, it is a concern of mine. And I guess we address that down the road.
And we have had development that did exactly that, cut down enormous trees and just came in and paid a fine, but the trees are gone forever, and these were all big ponderosas, and we didn't have anything in place,
Yeah.
so something in place to at least
Mhm.
hopefully make it less likely that that's gonna happen in the future is important for all of us, cause, you know, they're
Yeah.
kind of important.
Bob, I think you and I kind of have a similar concern with the tree code, which is like the goal, I would say, right, is we want developments to go with saving as many of these priority trees as possible, right? And like the worry is that when developers are looking at complying with these rules, they look at the first one and they're like, not gonna do that. Second one, not gonna do that. I'm just gonna pay the money and I'm going to just cut down all the trees and, you know, the city can build some somewhere else, plant some somewhere else or whatever. And I think that is a very real concern. And I think that that's kind of what we need to look at when we implement this and we look at how this is, like, how it's received, because like, then we can kind of look at like, well, why are they moving in this way? Like, why is this cheaper for them? Right? Like, is the first option, are we not giving them enough incentives? Right? Like, are they not seeing the value of complying with the code
Right.
in the correct way? Are we not like giving the like correct amount of stick in the carrot and stick situation? There's like also the like, is like 20% too much? Right? Like, it doesn't sound like too much, but who knows? Right? So like, it's kind of like you know, we kind of have to see.
And I'll say in the case studies that Pauline discussed, there were developments that had more than 20% of priority trees that were saved. And so there were certainly people, members of TRUAC, who felt that 20% should have been much higher.
Yeah.
Right? And I think, as Pauline stated, in my opinion, it's 20% as an incentive, right? I can preserve a lower percentage, but it's probably a greater DBH, right? By preserving the larger trees. And then if I preserve even more than 20%, that's when the incentives start kicking in. And what do I know about developers, but I think they like incentives, so.
They don't like setbacks and they want
So-
higher building heights.
I mean, they're not, we do have some carrots.
Yeah.
In place and
That's true.
hopefully, and I really do believe that this community, as members, it's clear we value trees.
Yeah.
And you can get more money for a lot with trees on it than without, right? And at the bottom line, I think that will work in our favor in preserving trees. But I hear what you're saying. So.
You also want to point out, just to make sure it's clear, that while the focus from council was to update the code to try to incentivize saving the larger trees, there are sites that may not have 20-inch trees
Correct.
on it at all. So that way, maybe 25% of all of these
Right.
small to medium trees can satisfy the code requirement as well, and also
Absolutely.
offers flexibility.
And the arborists, who are invaluable members of the committee, both said that, your healthiest trees may not be your largest trees, right?
Yeah.
And so, from a climate perspective and a life of a tree, having smaller trees can be beneficial, which actually makes me think of one more question. The replacement trees, if they choose to mitigate, what's the size of those trees? Are they street tree size?
It is, we have a replacement tree size and it is.
2-inch caliber, and then the evergreens are a height. Yeah.
Okay, I remember reading that.
Yeah. And then Jeff has a couple things he would.
Yeah, I thought I would just quick, a couple, Commissioner Gresson's, the concern about, the bad actor or the player, I think we have a highly engaged building community here. All of the biggest builders in town, especially on the single family side, they're all headquartered here, so they're at soccer games and other things. That's a very squishy thought, but I think as a builder who has built in a lot of different municipalities, land use in Oregon is weird. And frankly, you're forced sometimes to do density because the city has to prove that it was a good steward of the land it already has to be able to expand the UGB. So sometimes you have to do things that would not necessarily be what the market wanted in that moment. And so it's not always just about more units. Now, maybe in the apartment world or something that I'm not familiar with, maybe it's just all about height and density, but that is not the only thing that gets considered for sure. I wanted to point out a few things that we discussed. One, Commissioner Nelson, with regard to the fee in lieu, one thing that we were unanimous about was that once that pot of money is identified, we would like it to be prioritized toward affordable housing communities. So maybe this affordable housing developer could take advantage of that to use their tree replacement fund, save the tree replacement funds and use from the city's fund from the fee in lieu, which would then help make more projects work that were capitally affordable. We're also pretty unanimous that, we were working within a box of a pretty limited scope. And one of the things that we kept running into was the streets have to be so wide, the utility ditches have to be so wide. There's a lot of engineering standards that exist that make it hard to save trees. Where there might be an opportunity to. So we'd like to, that was one of our sort of addendum notes was please consider this. And a couple things that came up late that we frankly didn't talk about, but I would encourage this group to talk about is there are some wildfire standards that require the spacing of trees. And that was something that we did not spend a lot of time talking about. It came up late, and I think that's worth consideration since we're basically a WUI as a city. And then also, the industrial lands discussion, we just included all the zoning districts and it was basically only by type of application. And that also, there's a slim chance that affordable housing could go on industrial. So that's why the committee chose not to carve it out, but it was another one where it was a slim vote. I did, by the way, find the half acre, 1 acre, 2 acre, and it was a 7-6 vote on 1 acre. After some half acres went to 1 acre.
Yeah.
If that helps. So sorry for the quick rundown there. I just wanted to for the good of the order, give you some further context.
I have one more question for staff. Which is, so shortly after the tree code proposal went through and was drafted, the state did let me see if I remember the acronym, the Housing Production Advisory Council, right, created a list of proposed recommendations for like building housing and housing affordability. And there's a lot of stuff on there that I don't think has a chance at all to be implemented. But one of the things that is on their list of recommendations is a 10-year moratorium on in lieu of fees for trees that are smaller than 48 inches in diameter. And I don't know where that's going or what's going on with that, but if like that happens next year, do we have is there any like plans for how we're going to approach that? Is it just gonna like freeze the whole tree code? Will it be a partial? Like, will we have to rewrite our code to like be in compliance? Like,
I'll jump in because
Okay.
I happened to look at this again today. So yes, the state's Housing Production Advisory Council issued their final report and recommendations in February, and the provision regarding tree preservation, they called it, the recommendation was called modify tree codes in housing development situations. So
Okay.
modification, according to this committee, one of the elements was in cities, inside UGBs, on lots of less than 6,000 square feet. The committee's recommendation is not just that fees in lieu be suspended for 10 years, but that no city may deny a permit for the removal of a tree less than 48 inches in diameter. So if this recommendation were adopted, and to be clear, it has not been, yes, we would have to rewrite our code because it essentially says you can't do anything about somebody cutting down trees under 48 inches in diameter. So those are our double priority trees.
Right.
Yeah.
So again, that's a recommendation and it's not law, it's not policy yet, but if this recommendation or something like it were adopted into state law, yes, cities like Bend would need to go back to the drawing board and presumably the legislature would say, okay, cities, we're doing this, it's effective X date, you've got until Y date to modify your code to come into compliance. But this just shows how aggressive some of the considerations around housing are. And if that happens, we'll have to go back to the drawing board with maybe a new process, or maybe we'll just suspend our code. I don't know, but it depends on what the legislature decides to do, if anything.
Well, I can
Did-
tell you, I looked at.
Did you say that was
that is-
6,000 for properties under 6,000 square feet?
Yeah, there are provisions in there dealing with lots, I think, over and under 6,000 square feet.
Okay, 6,000 square feet is like an eighth of an acre.
And this report is, it's a brainstorm of ideas and recommendations. I mean, this one presents, this one presents some pretty obvious. It provokes obvious visceral reactions of people. I'm not saying that this is likely to ever become law, but it's an idea that's out there.
Scott, Jeff, any other questions from you?
No, not
I'm good.
Okay. Anyone at the table? Okay. Thank you very much. We appreciate it, Pauline. We'll see you next week. And we have a few more items on our agenda, but for anyone here, remember next Monday, 5:30, public hearing. We would love to hear from you and your thoughts on this proposal. So you can come in person or email, your choice.
Is there an email that goes out to all planning commissioners like there is for the city council?
Pauline can connect with that. Yeah, thank you. So next on the agenda is the approval of minutes. So, and these are from the April 8th, 2024 minutes.
They look fine to me.
I wasn't here. Okay,
Good. Yep.
good, okay. I don't think we need a motion on this, do
Getting
we?
thumbs up,
Yep.
minutes are approved.
Verbal thumbs up.
Reports, from planning commissioners. Either Jeff or Scott, anything from you?
Nope.
I have nothing, fighting COVID at the household. That's why I'm here once again, not me.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, so look forward to next Monday.
Yeah.
I thought it was a hoax.
It is.
Nothing for me, but thank you for all your work. It sounded like it was really, well, if you had 9 meetings instead of the 4 or 5 that you originally thought, it was more complicated. I know that it has been suggested multiple times in our community, but has never gotten this far, so good job.
Yeah, I'd also like to compliment Sue and the other members and Renee of TREC. I attended most of the meetings. I was so impressed at the thoughtfulness of all the individuals really striving towards something that could strike a reasonable balance.
It was an incredible amount of work, and I'm really impressed with the level of consensus that you guys were able to build. That's hard.
Yeah, it was an excellent group. And lots and lots of discussion, right, Renee?
Yes.
Went on, but yeah,
Great discussion.
yeah, it was, I felt fortunate to have been part of the group, learned a lot from it. So, so I do have a report. I have to step down from the planning commission.
Oh, no.
We're moving. So those aging parents in Ohio need to
No
be
little brother.
closer.
I have a little brother that's allows me to stay in bed.
No, I don't have that, so unless I
shoot.
can rent yours.
Well, you know, he's experienced. Where in Ohio?
So,
Make your price.
yeah, it would save us a lot of work. But I've only been on 1.5 years or so, but it's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed serving with all of you. So I don't know the process for a replacement, but
I'll follow up with you.
Okay.
You will be here next week,
I
right?
will,
As
yeah.
understand it.
Yeah.
But that would be your last meeting, it sounds like, on the 10th.
yeah, the 24th, I'm not sure.
Okay.
I don't know what day we put the truck in gear. So we'll see. Yeah, it happened really fast. We were not planning this. Renee, do you have a report?
Well, first, we will really miss having you on the planning commission. You've been a great member and thank you for the time that you have served.
Thank you.
Really contributed a lot and all your time on Truax. That was almost your entire tenure.
Yeah.
Dropping the mic.
The only report from me is just a reminder of the meeting next Monday, where this will be the tree code update will be the only topic on the agenda. It will be our public hearing for that matter. And we do expect what's online right now for your meeting for next week is the agenda and the staff transmittal memo and draft planning commission findings, which we always produce. Pauline will upload tomorrow the very latest version of the development code. So it's a combination of what's already online and available. And then those couple of slides she mentioned that she wants to make some revisions to, so that should be available tomorrow. So look for that. And it'll have a revision date on it. So
Okay.
that's it for me.
Ian?
I can pass.
Okay.
Oh, I do have one more thing. Nathan
Hello.
at the last meeting had volunteered so wonderfully to represent the commission at council this Wednesday evening for those two items that you made recommendations on at your last meeting, I think. So we'll see you there
Yes.
Wednesday evening.
I forwarded a summary of like a transcript that I'm gonna read out. When I did that, I don't know, was that forwarded to you guys? I don't really know because
I think it might have come in when I was out.
yeah,
Amy might have forwarded it. It looked good to me.
yeah.
It looked accurate.
There was one mistake which she corrected and I really appreciated, which was, I said one thing was unanimous when it was forwarded, but I've added that correction and yeah, so I'm prepared, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Woo.
Good night, everyone.
Oh, there's no, it's